presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
And this is Dialogue Assassination with political research specialist Mae Brussell. For KLRB, I'm Phil Kogan. Good afternoon, Mae. And here to continue another chapter in Dialogue Assassination, which is
it jumps around each week, Phil. We try to show the overall purpose of the show is to tell you that the political assassinations that took place in 1963 in Dallas, or in Los Angeles at the Ambassador Hotel, or in Memphis, Tennessee, the killings of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King are not dead issues, that the people who effected these murders are alive and control the government today. They decide our foreign policy. They're not dead issues. And the purpose is to bring out documentation and proof of these charges and talk about the weekly news and analyze how those assassinations affect this week's news.
Okay, with a profound task such as that, let's start.
Okay, we'll start. Mae Brussell is a comedian who has been talking about the political assassinations for years. Are you familiar with his many jokes or concerns or his serious study? He has been very involved in wanting to know who killed the Kennedys, particularly, and Martin Luther King. And he's back in the nightclub circuit. Various times he's been blackballed or kept off of programs because of his political ideas. And he came out last week with a statement which I think was apropos and very beautiful. He said, "It's my conviction that if Adolf Hitler were running a television network and said the comedians could use 8% of the freedom God gave them, they'd use only 3%. What Mae Brussell, I'm going to interpret for people who can figure things out for themselves, but just in case they can't, I'm going to interpret it that there is still a lot of freedom on the air that people aren't using, Phil. And when I talk about political assassinations or a coup that overthrew our government, I'm asked, how come you can be on the air? How does the media allow you? You have the right to speak up in this country. You still do. And KLRB gives me that right. And we've been on the air over 8 months now. And because I have the courage to say things and share documentation with you, we have been allowed to continue. And a lot of people are better informed than they were maybe 8 months ago because of the privilege of using the air to get the message across, and also the courage of the people at the station here allowing it. And if more people would speak up about things they know that are happening, they would be allowed to be heard too. Everyone's afraid, and the fear is only in their own mind. Now, we've been on the air a long time, and last week they played a tape of our show in New York City on WBAI.
For those who don't know, WBAI is the Pacifica station in New York City.
I received a telephone call last Wednesday that they would be telephoning me from New York City on Friday night to explain what Dialogue Assassination is in Carmel Valley. It is a phenomenon to have one program going every single week on the political assassinations in the United States. There's no station like it. There's no newspaper. Penn Jones Jr. in Midlothian, Texas, has a column in his weekly paper every week where he covers the political assassinations and documentation. We're going to do a whole program on his article today. But this kind of a show goes on every single week, and New York City has picked it up. And they telephoned me from New York City to my home Friday night, and we talked 5 hours. I thought it would be a 45-minute interview. It went on for 5 hours.
5 hours on the air in New York City, live from Carmel Valley.
From Carmel Valley.
Some phone bill WBAI is going to have.
Well, WBAI, they asked after a while for money to be sent in. It's like KQED, and people were calling in and wanted the show to go on, and they were donating money, and the show kept going until the fellows that were running that particular shift were leaving to go to a demonstration for the Berrigans the next day, and it was morning in New York City. And in Carmel Valley, too, as a matter of fact. And we went for 5 hours.
So, did you get some reaction as to how Dialogue Assassination went over with the people in New York State and the area there?
Well, that was Friday, and then there was Easter weekend, and I imagine this week I'll be getting a lot of feedback because people were calling, and they said, write to the station, and we'll forward it to Mae Brussell. And I brought in, if we have time later, I'll go through some of the questions that they asked and the summary that the announcer gave, which was beautiful. He summed up what I was trying to do. It was about 3:30 in the morning, and he was catching on to what was happening. And the great thing is that enough people called in and said, will you play it during the day, the show? So evidently they taped it. And sometime this week, 5 hours of Dialogue Assassination will be played in New York City. And they have the tape of our show last Saturday, Phil, and the one Saturday before. So we're getting to people who did not have access to this information before, and we're really surprised and could catch on very rapidly.
Now, you mentioned we're going to be discussing today a subject that was dealt with in a Penn Jones column.
Yeah, Penn Jones Jr. lives in Midlothian, Texas. It's a little bit south of Fort Worth. He was a general, full general in the United States Army. Penn is retired. He has a newspaper, and he was a friend of John Kennedy and the Yarborough group in Texas, the more liberal group of the Democratic Party. He's been active in politics all of his life. And he became worried after the murder of John Kennedy at Dealey Plaza, went right up to the grassy knoll, observed the scene, the people there, and has studied the political assassinations for 9 years. And he has a newspaper called the Midlothian Mirror, and it comes out once a week. It's like our Carmel Valley Outlook. And every week he publishes new documentation or evidence, and he can just barely scratch his research, like 1 hour a week barely scratches what I have here. He covers one subject a week. I talked to Penn this week because I wanted to use some information that he had passed on to me on the New York program, and we had a conversation. He told me about the article, which I received yesterday. Now, his paper, dated March the 30th, 1972, the Midlothian Mirror, has the following editorial. He runs it in his editorial section every week. He refers to a Warren Commission document number 75. I'll define what the document is. When the Warren Report was written, they used commission documents that were accumulated by the investigative agencies, the Secret Service, the FBI, the CIA, Dallas Police, all turned in information on anything related to the political murders in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. And these were under one roof, supposedly. And from these documents, the Warren Report was supposed to have been written. But we know the Warren Report was very selective in the documents it used. And when the Warren Report was published, they also published 26 volumes of witness testimony and documents, 15 volumes of testimony, 10 volumes of documents for people to see. But those 10 volumes of documents don't begin to cover existing documents that are still in the National Archives. And they are there on microfilm or in their perfect form. And if you are fortunate enough to go to Washington and go through them and can siphon out what they are, you have access to a great many of them. Some are locked up for 75 years and can't be seen in our lifetime. I'm trying to break that barrier, right now. And some are available. So Penn Jones and some other researchers got access to a document that has been released in January 1971. Last January it was released. And he had to use a reading glass to read it. It's a very tiny print and a poor reproduction. But it's a report of Special Agent Joseph Luffler, who reported an interview with Mr. Harold Stafford, the attorney for the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in New York City. And the document goes on to say Mr. Stafford informed that the Dallas files reflect several pieces of correspondence under the caption of Oswald, the repatriate, his wife, and family. His wife was 20 years old and his baby 4 months old. The third paragraph of the document reads this, in quotes, Mr. Stafford advised correspondence from the New York office indicates that Oswald served in the U.S. Marine Corps and went to Russia with the State Department's approval to accept employment as a radar specialist. Specifically, he was there 2.5 years and married a Russian girl. Health, education, and welfare is to be ready on a standby basis to give financial help if directed. End quote. Well, we know that when Oswald was ready to come home, he wrote to the State Department, who referred to the Health, Education, and Welfare, who arranged the financing of his trip home from Russia to the United States. This document says that Oswald was in the Marine Corps. in Russia with the State Department approval to accept employment as a radar specialist. Now, Oswald went to a radio shop in Minsk where Alexander Zeiger was the foreman and friend of Oswald in Minsk the whole time he lived there. And Alexander Zeiger is supposedly, the Warren Commission says, is a Jew from Argentina who left during the time of World War II but returned back to Minsk at the time that Oswald was working at the radio factory. And because of the link of Argentine and Nazis to Oswald, I wrote to Mr. Weisenfeld. He's the man that lives in Germany who seeks ex-Nazis who took the names of Jews and returned as Nazis. And I wrote to him in Europe trying to put a tracer on this Zeiger, and I also wrote to the Russian embassy because everybody linked with Leah Marina Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and in the State Department were Nazis, and I wanted to know if this man from Argentina was a Nazi. But then I'm going on to another section here of the article, Penn Jones' article, because he says the importance of this document is reinforced in William Manchester's book, The Death of a President. And he gives the quotes, and I'm going to read the exact pages from Death of a President. There was a commander, Oliver Hallett, from the Navy, who was in the Situation Room, the U.S. Navy, stationed in Moscow, and he knew Oswald, and his wife knew Oswald, and his daughter knew Lee Harvey Oswald. The commander, Oliver Hallett, from the U.S. Navy, was very familiar with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Soviet Union, and they remembered him at the time he was arrested for allegedly killing Kennedy. His family remembered him. His daughter, 16 years old, came home from school, was that the Oswald we knew? And this same Commander Hallett, Oliver Hallett of the U.S. Navy, who knew Oswald in the Soviet Union, was the man in the White House receiving the messages at the telephone the day that John Kennedy was killed. When Dean Rusk was leaving Honolulu on the way to Japan with 6 members of the cabinet in that airplane, and they got a message from Dallas that John Kennedy was shot, Rusk said, call the White House, and the mansion telephone is operated by the Navy by Commander Oliver S. Hallett. At the telephone, speaking to Dean Rusk, is the man that Oswald associated with in the Soviet Union. Now, I'm going to cover... How about that, Phil? We classify that in my system under coincidence with a question mark. That is a pretty heavy coincidence, and I hope when the hour is through, I will show you the whole U.S. Embassy and the Warren Commission is lying through their teeth about what Oswald was doing in the Soviet Union.
A statement that Penn Jones made in his column about Oswald being there at the request of the government is sort of different than what the Warren Commission says, right?
Well, the Warren Commission isn't going to tell you that Lee Harvey Oswald was sent from the Department of Navy to the Soviet Union. But we did one whole show just a few weeks back on Oswald being from Navy intelligence. And a lot of times, again, in 1 hour, we could do a 5-hour show like New York, just Navy intelligence. And then I think you get the picture. But people who take cassettes or tapes of these shows every week and put them together and play them with their friends can follow the shows on Navy intelligence and add them up, and follow the continuity of what we're saying. Now, I'm going into the Warren Commission. This is Warren Commission document number 75 that Penn Jones referred to. It's also Commission document 882 on page 12 and Commission document 903, page 3, state that Oswald served the U.S. Marine Corps and went to Russia with the State Department's approval to accept employment as a radar specialist. Now, in the hour that we're talking today, I'm going to use the quotations from William Manchester's book, where he refers to Oliver Hallett for a particular reason. You see, Oliver Hallett was never called as a witness before the Warren Commission, and the only man that saw Oswald in the Soviet Union swears Oswald was my baby. There were 2 men that saw him, and one who worked with him the particular day that Oswald was at the embassy. We'll go into the story of Oswald going to the embassy because I have to tell you that Commander Oliver Hallett's wife was the receptionist at the embassy on a Saturday when nobody else was there, when Oswald appeared to speak with John McVicker. And John McVicker and Richard Snyder are written up in the book, Who's Who in the CIA. We're going to go into who the men were at the embassy. But I'm going into the Manchester book. William Manchester has 3 references in The Death of a President on Commander Oliver Hallett. But in 9 years' research, there's no mention in the Warren Commission findings, memos, or documentations about the commander who's going to be at the White House at the time John Kennedy is killed and who knew Oswald in the Soviet Union. This is never mentioned in 26,000 pages, 26 million words. It's completely quiet. I don't know how William Manchester got the information for his book on Commander Hallett or his memory of Oswald. The Warren Commission has no evidence of him.
But Manchester's references to Hallett haven't been challenged, to my knowledge.
No, the Manchester book was written after the Warren report was published, and the Warren Commission says they're through with their work. No, but this is the first time this has gone on the air, and hopefully, again, this tape will go to New York, and maybe people will begin to put this thing together. I'm going to talk about the Manchester references to Commander Hallett. Then I'm going into the testimony of Richard Snyder at the American Embassy on October the 31st, 1959, when Oswald appeared at the embassy. And then I'm going into the testimony of John McVicker, also at the embassy in Moscow that same day. Each of them had no further contact with Oswald, nor did any other American except 2 newspaper women. So I don't know where Commander Oliver Hallett and his child got to know Lee Harvey Oswald. Then I'm going into the Warren Report, where they mention, 4 sections of the Warren Report mention Oswald in the Soviet Union, and I'm going to show you how they skirt around and absolutely avoid any mention of Commander Hallett at all, and somebody is lying through their teeth. And then my conclusion is going to be, I'll state it once, and again at the end of the show, where did William Manchester learn about Commander Oliver Hallett? Why was he not called as a witness? He and his wife and child knew Oswald. Where in the Soviet Union did they meet him? How often did they see him? A man this important to be in the White House receiving the messages from the Secretary of the State when the President and the Vice President are out of Washington. All top officials are out of Washington, and this man is receiving the messages at the White House. Where did he meet Oswald, and how often? And it is interesting that people knowing Oswald in the Soviet Union are at the White House at the time that John Kennedy was killed. Now, in Manchester's book, there's 3 references to this particular man. On page 31, he says, working in the White House in the President's Situation Room was Commander Oliver Hallett of the U.S. Navy. He was there Wednesday night before the assassination, and his position, his presence in the mansion was an extraordinary irony. Manchester calls it irony. I would like to reword the Manchester book. It says Hallett was posted to the White House 9 months before the assassination. He had done submarine duty, but prior to that he served in the U.S. Embassy in the USSR as a naval attaché. He served in the embassy, and his wife was the embassy receptionist. And his wife mentioned, Manchester uses the reference that Oswald strolled into the front hallway in October 1959 and slammed his green passport on Joan Hallett's desk and came to renounce his citizenship. Now, they said that Joan Hallett and their daughter Carolyn and Commander Hallett returned from Moscow in 1962. They still talked of Moscow, and sometimes the commander and his wife and their 16-year-old daughter Carolyn wondered what became of that seedy malcontent. And they recalled him vividly. They remembered him. This is Manchester saying they talked of Moscow. They remembered him vividly. They remembered his arrogance, the peculiar density of his eyes, the way he would snatch the New York Herald Tribune from Joan's desk. And then he had been a great reader, and he devoured every word. The way Manchester writes it, you would think that he had been in there many times, the way he would snatch. He didn't use the way he snatched the paper from Joan's desk. Manchester says the way he would snatch the paper from her desk and read every word of the New York Herald Tribune, which Manchester has as a story going. You think he came into the embassy many times, and they remembered him well. He had been obnoxious, but he made a distinct impression, and all 3 of the Halletts remembered his face, and they remembered the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. And they assumed he was in the Soviet Union.
Now, where she makes the reference to Oswald coming in and slamming his green passport down and renouncing his citizenship, did they know him before that moment, or was it after that they got to know him?
Well,
in the Manchester book, anyway.
In the Manchester book, he just, on page 31, says the same Howard who was taking the President's Situation Room at the, in the White House at the embassy, remembers, he and his wife remember Lee Harvey Oswald when he came in the hallway and slammed his passport on the desk. And they, meaning Commander and Mrs. Howlett, still talked of Oswald, and they recalled him vividly, the Commander and his wife, and their daughter, all three. Manchester says all three of the Howletts remembered the face.
They didn't ever see him before that point?
No,
then?
Never saw him before.
After that point?
Well, this is what we don't know. If Oswald was in the Marines, in the Navy, in the Soviet Union, he was in Navy intelligence, and if this commander was in the Navy attaché at the Soviet Union, we don't know. This is the thing I'm trying to bring up on the show. If all three, the wife and the commander and the child, remembered him vividly, I want to go into what happened at the embassy that day and show how the Warren Commission handles the incident.
Now, you made the statement that Oswald was in Navy intelligence. We've spent time on that on past programs, but do you want to briefly document his role in the Navy and how you can say he was in Navy intelligence at one time?
Well, we'd have to go into what he was doing when he was in radar with his top secret clearances, security clearances, his learning Russian while he was in the Marines and being at Sugi Air Base where the training was going out for the U-2 flights, and his access to all the top secret radar information in the whole Pacific area, and the way he received the money to get into the Soviet Union, the visa that got him in. That's, again, another show. It's good to go back that he went to Helsinki and was speeded into Russia, which you usually don't have that privilege. You're held up there. He didn't have papers to get in originally. And when he wanted to return, the state, he wrote a letter, now I'm ready to come back and don't prosecute me for anything. His mother had been to the White House, the State Department, my son's a member of the CIA, and 3 weeks later they sent a letter, through a diplomatic pouch to the Soviet Union, and then Oswald wrote to the embassy, well, I'm ready to come home, but he wanted guarantee in writing they wouldn't prosecute him, and they sent him the money to come home, and he was met at the harbor in New York City in a limousine and taken, this is getting back to the whole Navy intelligence trip. To document that, we'd have to bring in a lot, but that's the gist of the assumption that Oswald had red carpet treatment, and he was there's every reason to believe that he worked very closely with all the top government officials, John Connally, who was Secretary of the Navy, and Rusk, Dean Rusk, Secretary of the State. A researcher in Los Angeles is doing a book on just that subject, David Lifton. But in this particular instance, Manchester is mentioning that the Howlett family recalls Oswald very well. Now, they knew him very well enough to describe him. They described his close-set eyes. He was a spindly youth. He was bitter. He was a misfit, a weedy malcontent. He was arrogant, and so forth. And then he would snatch papers from her, and he was obnoxious. That was the impression of Commander Howlett's family. Now, in Death of a President, William Manchester jumps to page 194 and says, when President Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, 9 miles out of Honolulu with 6 members of the cabinet, was flying over the Pacific. And he called the members of his cabinet and told them the president was shot. Then he said, get me the White House. And in less than a minute, the mansion came through. Commander Oliver Howlett in the Situation Room was on the other end, and Howlett relayed the messages about the president. William Manchester brings up the subject of Commander Oliver Howlett. Now, on page 286, William Manchester brings up Commander Howlett again. He said, while Captain Fritz in Dallas, Texas, was interrogating Lee Harvey Oswald, he was asking questions about him, but Commander Howlett heard the suspect's name and said, I wonder if that's the guy I knew in the Soviet Union. And Howlett's daughter, Carolyn, came home from school and saw Oswald's picture on their television set and said, he was in Moscow. He was the one. She recognized him. She's 16 years old, goes to a private school in Washington where the Kennedy children go, Robert Kennedy and Ted Kennedy's children go. She came home from this school and recognized Lee Harvey Oswald. Manchester said Howlett had recognized him before the networks put on his Soviet record. The whole family recognized Lee Harvey Oswald. So now I'm going to the testimony of Richard Snyder in the American Embassy of Volume 5, page 260, because he was the first secretary in the American Embassy in Tokyo, and then he was in Moscow from 1959 to 1961. I'm going to read you the testimony of Richard Snyder and John McVicker. It's part of a chapter of a book I'm writing on the assassination. The chapter is called Who Minds the House? This is about the embassy in Moscow. And after I finished my research on who was minding the house, meaning the embassy in Moscow, the American embassy, and I had located Richard Snyder as being charged of all the intelligence operations of Lee Harvey Oswald from the moment he entered the Soviet Union until he left, and I had settled for John McVicker being in charge of Marina Oswald's exit and entry. Then I received that little book that I brought in and showed you that we refer on the air, published in East Germany, Who's Who in the CIA. And on page 353, you have John J. McVicker, born 1922, and it gives his background, U.S. Navy from 1949, and Department of State for 1966, works for the CIA, Office of Operations included New Delhi, Hong Kong, and Moscow. That is John McVicker, who is in charge of Marina Oswald's exit from the Soviet Union, and her sole contact was with John McVicker of the CIA, U.S. Navy, before he went to the State Department. Then I turned to Richard Snyder. This is the same book that has Mr. Winokur, who sent the historians to write the Warren Report. And I come to Richard Snyder, born 1910, speaks German, French, Japanese, captain in the G2 of the U.S. Army. From 1950, Defense Department of State, 1957, works for the CIA, Office of Operation, Frankfurt, Main, Munich, and Moscow. And he was in charge of Lee Harvey Oswald. That's the background of John McVicker and Richard Snyder, a brief background. Well, Mr. Snyder's called before the Warren Commission, and his testimony is in Volume 5, and the page from 260 on. And they say, do you remember the circumstances under which Lee Harvey Oswald came to the Soviet Union? Now, the story briefly was that Lee Harvey Oswald arrived in Russia 3 weeks earlier, but on October the 31st, 1959, he walked into the American embassy, placed down his passport, said, I'm going to become a Russian citizen. I don't like America. I'm a Marxist. I'm going to stay over here. I'm going to give the Russians all of my radar information, or I have given it to them. And I've been here 3 weeks. I've given them information I had in the Marines. And he presented this to the American embassy. Now, it's interesting that Lee Harvey Oswald shows up on the day that the embassy's closed. It's closed on Wednesday, and it's closed on Saturday. And there's several people at the embassy, supposedly. The stories vary, and I'm going to show you how they vary. Mr. Snyder begins, the embassy was closed, so it had to be on a Wednesday or a Saturday that he came. And I'm not sure if he brought his passport into me, or whether he came in, it was brought to me, rather, or whether I met him at the door and someone brought him in. I don't recall whether one of my secretaries might have been on duty that afternoon. Normally, she would not have been. Now, this is before the Warren Commission. He's not sure if his secretary was on duty. But the person he's talking about happens to, her husband's in the White House as Navy attaché the day that Kennedy's killed. Now, this man is talking about a secretary. He's not talking about Lee Harvey Oswald, and the wife, who this woman's husband is. You think she's just a normal legal stenographer. And the Warren Commission doesn't check any of this. He says, I don't recall whether my secretary there. Normally, she would not have been. Well, I have to digress from Snyder's testimony and say that nothing in the Warren Report is normal. It's a Saturday. No one's supposed to be there. Not even the secretary, but Oswald, the expatriate, has arrived. He's been 3 years with top security clearance and mastered all the radar in the Pacific, and he's in the Soviet Union. He comes on a day when everyone's off. Now, he goes on. They asked him, was anyone present when you had an interview with Lee Harvey Oswald? And Richard Snyder said, Mr. McVicker was working in the office adjoining mine. The offices in Moscow are quite small, and the door between the offices is usually open. And I think Mr. McVicker told me he was in the next office. I don't recall whether he was ushered into my office by the secretary, meaning Oswald, or an employee, but I was told that there was someone waiting for me outside, and I got him. Now, when John McVicker was called as a witness before the Warren Commission in Volume 5, they said he described his work at the embassy, and they said, did you have an occasion to see Lee Harvey Oswald? And he said, I was one of 2 officers in the counselor section of the embassy, and I had occasion to see Oswald and talk to him briefly. I was present in the office at the time he was interviewed by Mr. Snyder, because we had the office about the size of this room with 2 desks in it.
Okay, let's
let's
continue on with the interview. This is Dialogue Assassination with political research specialist.
But now John McVicker says, we had an office the size of this room with 2 desks in it, and Mr. Snyder's desk was at one end and mine was at the other. And we did our business in the same room, and this was an unusual case, and I recall the conversation. This is why I called my chapter, Who's Minding the Store? One says they had 2 separate rooms and the door might have been open and there were cubby holes. The other says we had one great big room so you couldn't help but hear because all our desks were in one room. And he said, I had no further contact with Oswald after October the 31st, 1959, McVicker said, when he entered the embassy, and to the best of my recollection, I never laid eyes on Oswald again. Mr. Coleman of the Warren Commission said, did Oswald speak to you at all, or was his conversation with Mr. Snyder? And Mr. McVicker said, I think all his conversation was with Mr. Snyder. As I recall, he said a few words to those of us who were in the office, myself and the secretary, on his way out of the office, probably. But I don't really remember much about that if he said anything at all. Now, this has nothing about reading the secretary's paper or throwing down his passport to her, having any dialogue, that they would remember all the descriptions that the secretary and her daughter and husband are going to throw out. If she left the office, he might have said something, but I don't recall anything of that at all. Mr. Coleman of the Warren Commission said, I take it that after the October 31st, 59, you had no further contact with Oswald. And McVicker said, that is my recollection, no contact with Oswald. I didn't even recall until after I saw the file that I had interviewed his wife, and to my recollection, I never laid eyes on Oswald. Now, John McVicker, I have to say, is lying through his teeth. He handled the whole paper. His wife didn't meet any of the qualifications or clearances to come to the United States until certain waivers were passed, and there were letters going back and forth from that embassy, get Oswald home. It's the best interest of the United States. The Department in San Antonio of Immigration said she doesn't qualify yet. She doesn't meet the standards. And the embassy in Moscow, the U.S. embassy, was working with Marina Oswald, pressing her, and he says that until the assassination, he didn't even remember having handled her papers. There aren't that many Russian wives coming to the United States. Now, Richard Snyder, in Volume 5, told him to come back. He said, I told him that the consulate was closed, and I didn't have a secretary there that day to prepare the papers. And if he wanted to come back during normal business hours, I'd go through with him. That if he wanted to give up his citizenship, he said, come back on normal business hours. Well, Oswald appears on a Saturday at the American Embassy, and he never appears again until July 61, when he's ready to get his papers to come home and begin the wheels moving. But he calls his normal business hours aren't there. The secretary isn't there. Congressman Ford said, did he converse with any other member of the staff, to your knowledge, during that first visit? Because the other visits are later in 62 when he's to come home. Snyder says no. Not at this time. He definitely did not. Gerald Ford is asking, any member of the staff of the embassy? No, he did not. Well, Commander Hallett remembers Oswald distinctly, and so does his wife and child, and they were members of the U.S. Navy. You see, but the Warren Commission is devious. They separate the Navy from the embassy staff. So if he doesn't meet the staff, he could still be meeting with someone from the Navy. You see, they don't say that is there anyone else of government officials. They say, did he converse with any other member of the staff? He says, no, not this time. And I don't think he did during this time I was there. As far as I know, he had no knowledgeable conversation then, he says, with anyone there. With anyone there. Actually, there was only, when he came in, 2 officers, McVicker, myself, and the time I left, 3 officers with whom he might have talked. Now, John Snyder is saying there were 3, but the Warren Commission doesn't say who was the 3rd officer. You see, Phil, so I'm asking, was the third officer the one that ends up in the White House, November the 22nd, 1963? You see, I cross-filed in my own research under coincidence, under Navy intelligence, under Oswald in the Soviet Union, and witnesses not called, in order to get a pattern of operation, to understand the size of the Warren Report. You have to take these subjects and put them into columns like mathematical problems. So he said there were 3 officers with whom he might have talked, and it is conceivable that either of the other 2 officers would have talked to him, knowing it is inconceivable, then he says, that the others would have talked to him, knowing my interest in the case, or if I were not there, somebody would have done so without making a memo for the file for me. So it's inconceivable that anyone would have talked to him. And he goes into the only 2 Americans that did talk to Lee Harvey Oswald later in Russia before he went on to Minsk. It was Priscilla Johnson and Aline Mosby, the newspaper women. No mention of Mr. Hallett at all. Now, Richard Snyder gives a description of Lee Harvey Oswald in 1959. He was neatly, presentable dressed. He had a nice physical appearance. He was well-shaven, competent-looking. He was extremely sure of himself. He seemed to know what his mission was. He took charge of the conversation from the beginning. I believe he put his passport on my desk. I'm not sure. I may have asked for it. Now, Mrs. Howell is telling how he slammed it arrogantly on her desk. He's saying he either put it on my desk or I asked for it. In general, his attitude was quite arrogant, he says, but he repeated he was neatly dressed, well composed, a respectable-looking young man. They asked him if the letter he wrote to the embassy 3 days later could have been his because it was such a good letter. He says he writes a good letter. I would not say it was beyond his capability. He strikes me as an intelligent man. He was articulate, quite intelligent. I don't think from what I saw of him that the letter is beyond his capacity to have written. Now, Snyder said he had no previous knowledge of the presence of Oswald in the USSR. He gave me a written statement, which he handed, which he also mentioned orally, on why he came. He gave me a letter and his passport, and the total interview was in my hands. He said he kept his passport, and then Navy attachés at the embassy sent a telegram to the Navy Department telling them Oswald, a Marine, had offered radar information to the Soviets. Now, Snyder was shown a telegram from the Navy attaché at the embassy, but he denied that it was ever shown to him when it went off. The Navy attaché was sending telegrams saying this ex-Marine has offered radar information to the Soviets. But Snyder, again, does not mention who the Navy attaché is, or if the Navy attaché, he rules out that he could have seen or met Oswald. But Hallett says he knew him well, you see. And Snyder, in charge of the embassy, denied that the wire sent from the Navy was ever shown to him. Oswald came in, he repeated, and either placed his passport on the desk or the table. And then he left Moscow in December 59 and went down to Minsk. Senator Cooper said, did he talk to any other people in the embassy besides you? And Snyder said, not to my knowledge, no, sir. John McVicker says he was in the room and a third man was there. And Senator Cooper said, do you know of any other members of the embassy staff that talked to him? And Snyder said, I have no reason to believe that anyone else talked to him other than myself at this time. Up until that time that I left Moscow, Oswald was my baby, and I don't think anyone else talked to him in the embassy. Now, you see, the point is this, that these people can be very sure. I'm going to show you how the Warren Report carries Oswald in the Soviet Union as not being an agent. Because Oswald didn't talk to anyone in the American embassy doesn't mean he didn't talk to naval attachés outside the embassy. If he was in Navy intelligence, they swear that he only came into the embassy 2 times. But he could be meeting other people. Because the people remembered him. His daughter, the commander's daughter remembered him. His wife remembered him. And so that they're very sure that Oswald couldn't have seen anybody in the embassy. But what's that got to do with it? A lot of people saw Oswald in the Soviet Union outside the embassy.
So you're wondering again why Commander Hallett wasn't called as a witness?
Absolutely.
And are you saying then that these references that are made saying that Oswald didn't talk to anyone else is a direct cover-up of the fact that he was meeting or had conversations with Commander Hallett of the Navy?
Absolutely. Yeah, see, the Warren Report, now we're going to get to the Warren Report because a lot of people still wonder. It's very difficult to understand the amount of research that I have done or the way I went about it. And I began with the original source, which was the Warren Report, which is 800 pages, and I read sections of that which were particularly interesting to me, such as Oswald in the Soviet Union or in the Marines or in the Dallas-Fort Worth area or in Mexico. Oswald as a person, his modus operandi. And then I read the commission hearings, the 15 volumes where witnesses were called who had access or met Lee Harvey Oswald, and the simple discrepancies like the John McVicker versus Snyder thing in the embassy is so basic. One says he wasn't present, the other said he had to be because they shared the same room. Somebody isn't telling the truth, obviously. So then I go to the commission exhibits. Now, the Warren Report has several sections on Oswald in the Soviet Union. They carry it in four different sections. One in Chapter 6, showing there was no conspiracy in the Soviet Union as a Russian agent. Then they show he was not a U.S. agent. Then they have a section called Oswald's Motives in Chapter 7, where he goes to the Soviet Union. And in the appendix, appendix number 7, they go into the biography of Lee Harvey Oswald from birth to death, and there's a section on the Soviet Union, and then there's appendix in volume 15 on his renouncing his citizenship. And so I'm going into what the Warren Report says because this is the published version, and I'm trying to show you some of the discrepancies in the commission hearings. The conspiracy section of the Warren Report says the commission found nothing in the circumstances of Oswald's entry into the Soviet Union that indicate that he was an agent of the USSR. Well, that's true. That's the most reliable information concerning the period that Oswald spent in Moscow comes from the embassy and two American newspaper reporters, Eileen Mosby and Priscilla Johnson. Now, he saw Priscilla Johnson for 5 hours, and he saw Eileen Mosby for 2 hours. He went to the embassy on October the 31st to renounce his citizenship. He spoke to Richard Snyder, who refused to accept his renunciation. He would have to return the complete necessary papers, they told him, and they told him to come back when they were open for business. The Warren Report says he would have to return to complete the papers of renunciation. Oswald gave the council his passport and declared that he had volunteered Soviet government information about radar as a Marine. Now, that is the Warren Report on Oswald in the conspiracy section. It doesn't mention Richard Snyder. It doesn't mention Admiral Hallett at all. It leaves those names out and just says he saw Richard Snyder and he did not return to renunciate himself as a citizen. He just left his passport at the embassy while he was living in the Soviet Union. Now, on page 325 in that same section on Oswald, there's a section to prove Oswald was not a U.S. agent. It says, in quotes, Oswald returned to his American passport to the embassy in Moscow in October 59. Thereafter, while in the Soviet Union, Oswald had numerous contacts with the American embassy, both in person and through correspondence. Now, I don't know where these numerous contacts come up there because he went once in October 59 and then later when he wanted to return in 62.
Wasn't it some of the testimony that it said he was only there once or twice?
That's right.
Once on that day that he tried to renounce his citizenship, and the other time
to get the papers to come back.
When he wanted to leave the Soviet Union.
That's right.
But within the Warren Report, it says he had numerous contacts.
Well, because various men were writing different chapters of the Warren Report, I have a whole, it's a 9-page document by John J. McCloy, who was supposed to write this chapter, and that was the one we read on the air once with no verification of any of this. Different men were writing it. So somebody put in the numerous contacts, and they didn't check it out because he only had 2. But if they mean written contacts with the embassy, it says through correspondence. He had 2 personal. And then the Warren Report said he received a loan from the State Department to cover his costs home.
Well, this numerous contacts thing still sticks in my mind.
He's wide open.
Do you think it's possible that just as this could be something that should have said 2 contacts, that it could be that somebody writing that particular chapter had seen other documents that aren't within the commission documents that showed that he had met many times, and that in writing this chapter, he accidentally put it in, and it was pulled out of the documents?
Now this is the thing, that in the National Archives, locked up for 75 years, there are many, many documents, Oswald and the Soviet Union. That's right. That's where the problem lies, is that somebody has seen the documents that are locked up, as well as the ones that are being declassified now, and the word slipped, numerous contacts. That's right. Then the Warren Report goes on to say, officials who were directly involved with dealing with Oswald's case on these matters have testified before the commission. Now, one of those, Commander Hallett, never testified before the commission, but they go on. Director John J. McCone of the CIA and Deputy Director Richard Helm of CIA testified that no one connected with the CIA ever interviewed Oswald or communicated with him in any way. Now, Health, Education, and Welfare has this document I read of Ed Jones saying that they're to look out for Oswald, take care of his way home, and so forth, the money home. Navy commander stationed in the White House, right at the time Kennedy was killed, had contact with Oswald in the Soviet Union. The State Department letters state that he was stationed in the Soviet Union as part of the Marines, and who's who in the CIA lists John McVicker and Richard Snyder. And yet, under oath, John McCone and Richard Helms, now head of the Central Intelligence Agency, say that no one connected with the CIA ever interviewed Oswald or communicated with him in any way.
Well, the person who's going to say, well, that's full of holes, as far as citing these as evidence that he did have contact with the CIA, is going to say, well, who's who in the CIA? That's published in East Germany. That's obviously a lie. And what State Department document says that he was stationed in the USSR?
Oh, there's a lot of
as a
them.
Marine.
In the commission hearings in the 16 volumes, one of the things that always struck me so funny are the things of Oswald, U.S. Marines in the USSR. And I thought, well, what has the Marines got to do? How much of a Navy do we have in the USSR?
But was he stationed?
Well, that's the way the paper reads it. It mentions some of the State Department, the Navy papers that are in the 16 volumes have him in the Marines in the USSR. And then they've got big black words crossing out all kinds of information on the pages that's censored. They published the letters and they blacked out the words. So,
but stationed implies that he was sent there, that he's supposed to be there.
Yeah, yeah. But here we have in volume chapter 7 in the Warren Report, under possible motives, they have Oswald. They just mentioned that Oswald went on October the 31st to the American Embassy, and Mr. Snyder was the second secretary. In the history of the motive of why he would commit the murder, they just said that he went to the embassy and presented his passport to Richard Snyder. Again, no mention of McVicker or the third man or anything, anybody else being the embassy. The secretary, the wife of the particular man we're talking about, in the commander in the Navy. They don't mention who the secretary was at all, Mr. Hallett's wife. Now, under Appendix 7, under the biography of Lee Harvey Oswald, they said he took a taxi to the American Embassy, and when the receptionist asked him to sign the register, he laid his passport on the desk and said he wanted to renounce his American citizenship. And Richard Snyder was summoned and invited Oswald into his office. They asked Richard Snyder the question about Lee Harvey Oswald signing the guest register at the American Embassy with his name on the register. And he said, no, in lieu, when a person visits the American Embassy, in his testimony, he said they can, if they exchange their passport with you and leave it with you, that is identification of a signature on the book. They didn't want the name on the book. And this is another way of keeping Lee Harvey Oswald. You know, he was in the Soviet Union. He was going to be there for a while, and other people coming through may see his name on that book and know what he's doing at the Soviet Union. So as he walks in the door, Appendix 7, that's page 693 of the Warren Report, says that he went to the receptionist. Now, that's the wife of Commander Hallett. And they asked him to sign the register, and he laid his passport on the desk and said he can renounce his citizenship. Now, Richard Snyder said that's a formality at the embassy, and John McVicker testified that Oswald seemed to be coached in all his legal rights and all the things to do as he entered or expatriate. He left all the doors open, to return back to America. This is quite different from what she says, that she remembers the arrogance, the peculiar density of his eyes, the way he would snatch the New York Herald Tribune from his desk, and the way he slammed, she says he slammed down that that passport and was arrogant. This is quite different from laying it there as a formality in the embassy. And in Appendix 7, there's nothing about laying this thing down, slamming it down. It was a formality that you use at the embassy that he put this particular document on the table. Now, the Warren Report says Oswald seldom left the hotel in Moscow. His routine was broken only by another interview by the USSR passport office. And then he had a visit from somebody named Rima who gave him lessons in Russian. He was called to the Soviet passport office and told he's being sent to Minsk. Now, the Warren Report, in showing that there's no conspiracy or no contact with anybody, emphasizes over and over again that he only went to the embassy once. He didn't return. He only met 2 newspaper women. So where he was meeting Commander Howell, you see, he used to go to Minsk then and disappear. And John McVicker and Richard Snyder say he never returned. And they claim that until 1961, they claim, and we know this is not true, that they had no knowledge, the embassy or anybody, where Lee Harvey Oswald was. So I pose the question this hour, where did Commander Howell and his daughter, even if the wife was a receptionist, and she's telling you how he used to take her papers, which implied many visits, but where did his daughter and he know Lee Harvey Oswald from to pick up, on the day of the assassination? Now, Appendix, the Warren Report says the American Embassy in Moscow had not heard from Oswald after it received his letter dated November the 3rd until February 13th, 1961, where he asked to return home from the United States. Now, in January...
Tilt.
Until.
No, tilt, I'm saying.
Yeah.
It says the American Embassy in Moscow had not heard from Oswald until, or after it received his letter dated the
November
3rd of November 59, and yet the Warren Commission report a little bit back, you quoted saying...
was in contact with...
numerous contacts, both personal contact and through correspondence.
With the agency. That's right.
That doesn't coincide.
Well, no, nothing about the Warren Report does. We have to keep reiterating that for people who wonder what dialogue assassination is or pick it up in the
Those two statements just are opposed to each other.
Yes, well, it's good to read this out loud. I mean, you and I sharing information and hopefully people picking it up. That's what I'm trying to point out. That's the basis of my research, to find out where the truth does lie. And you can find truth if you go to every avenue of each one speaking. You can narrow it down somewhere. Now, in January 1961, Marguerite Oswald took a train to Washington, D.C. and called the White House and said, my son is a CIA and he's in Russia and I would like to have contact with him. He's been away a long time. And the State Department called her and she came right over to have an interview with men in the State Department. And then a diplomatic pouch was sent to the Soviet Union in February 1961, February 13th. And then Oswald wrote a letter saying, I would like to return to the United States. I want my passport back and full citizenship. I didn't renunciate my citizenship, and I want full protection. Now, we'll do another show in the future. On February the 28th, Oswald said he would return to the American Embassy. He was ready to come back to the United States. March the 17th, 1961, he met Marina Oswald.
How does the Warren Report handle the statement by Oswald's mother about her son being in the CIA?
Well, they handle it like they handle everything else. They ignore it. She was a witness for the Warren Commission, Volume 1. Her testimony is accurate. It's historically valid. What are you going to handle if an intelligence agency overthrows the government through all these complicated methods? The few people who are in the know are going to speak up. You handle it by ignoring it. They just ignore her.
They did not produce anything to challenge that?
Well, they
any evidence?
Yeah, we could go into the way they skirt around. They say, of course, he wasn't an agent. We asked Richard Helms or John, Mr. McCone. Of course, she wasn't an agent. Richard Helms would know. And that's the way it's left.
But what would Richard Helms say?
Well, it was, real. Appendix 15 of the Warren Report on Oswald attempting to renounce his U.S. citizenship. Citizenship says American officials in Moscow had no knowledge of his arrival. He went to the embassy October 31st, 1959. He placed his passport on the receptionist's desk, and informed her he came to dissolve his citizenship, and she immediately summoned the counsel, Richard Snyder, who invited Oswald into his office. Now, I'm repeating what the Warren Report has these sections on Oswald at the embassy in different chronological order, on the motive or whether he's an agent or his life. Now, each one has the same story. It has nothing about his grabbing her newspapers, having an altercation, their chance to really know whether he was arrogant or what his personality was like. You see, they remembered him vividly, getting back to Commander and Joan Hallett and their daughter Caroline. They talked of Moscow. They remembered him vividly. This is the Manchester book. All three remembered his face, the way he would snatch the New York Herald Tribune from Joan's desk. This is what they remembered, and they remembered how he slammed down his passport in arrogance, and they remembered that seedy malcontent or witty malcontent. They had a distinct memory about his obnoxiousness. But in Appendix 15 of the Warren Report, he placed it again on the desk, and she summoned immediately. There was no chance to read the Herald Tribune or to go through all the things that he was doing. And he went into the office, so Carolyn, the daughter, couldn't remember Oswald that well, because from then on, Snyder says he was my baby and no one else saw him. So if he was his baby, how did the whole family, the Hallett family, get into it? Now, if she had the passport, there's a question. She says she has the passport. Snyder said he always has the passport. Where was the commander? Where was Caroline? Why doesn't the Warren Report tell you the receptionist's husband is going to be receiving the phone calls at the White House when Kennedy was killed? The Warren Report says in the room with Snyder was his assistant, John McVicker, who observed what ensued. This is the Warren Report, Appendix 15. Snyder says McVicker said Snyder says he was alone with Oswald. McVicker said he was present. The Warren Report says McVicker observed. I have to show that back and forth there is no accuracy in what they're saying, and the Warren Report chooses the testimony they want. Then it says, having taken the passport back from the receptionist, Oswald placed it on Snyder's desk. He walked in. She asked him to sign the book. He wouldn't sign the book, you see. He put it on her desk. He took it back and put it on Snyder's desk. Snyder did not permit Oswald to renounce his citizenship at that time, but told him if he would return when the embassy was open, that would be completed. And Oswald never returned to the Soviet embassy until he was ready to return home to the United States.
Now, what's all this? Now, if Oswald met with other people that the Warren Report never refers to, and if you accept the premise that Oswald was sent to the Soviet Union, the question is, why was he sent there if indeed he was sent there?
Well, that would take, again, we have to say, we should do a 5-hour show like New York, except I was exhausted. The whole thing was that Gary Powers wrote in his book that he believed Oswald was instrumental in bringing down the U-2 plane. With his radar knowledge, he was capable of bringing down the U-2 plane. Now, bringing down the U-2 flight ended the summit conference that President Eisenhower was to have with the Russian government. And a lot of people believe that the summit conference should have gone on. We should have admitted our error. The summit, you see, if Oswald was an agent of the intelligence agency, and if our Central Intelligence Agency didn't want coexistence with the Soviet Union, they wanted the Cold War going, they would fly the U-2 just prior to the summit conference, bring it down, and, then if the Russians weren't going to bring the U-2 down or bring it down, Oswald, with his radar knowledge, could bring down that U-2 flight of Gary Powers, breaking the summit conference. The Cold War would continue, and the purpose would be achieved by the people that are in power that do not want coexistence with the Soviet Union.
But did the assassination have anything to do with it at that time, or was that plan spawned later?
Well, Oswald's planning of the assassination and using Lee Harvey Oswald, I know from the moment he left the Soviet Union, I know that the assassination was planned in the 60s when John Kennedy took oath, and I have an article on that coming out in The Realist, the 13th anniversary issue of The Realist. On the planning stages, the title of the article is How Richard Nixon Came to Power. And it's on the political assassinations that the machinery was set up to kill anybody who didn't go along with the existing State Department policy of the Dulles brothers. And if Allen Dulles was the chief of our CIA and the overall planner of it, And if Oswald was an agent of the intelligence system, they could botch the complete summit conference. Now, in summary, what I'm trying to say is that there is a document that came out of the National Archives in 1971 that has to do with a commander, Howlett, in the White House. He was at the control room at the mansion of the White House the day Kennedy was killed. Commander Howlett, his wife, his daughter Caroline, remember Oswald in the Soviet Union. They were never called as witnesses. I'm trying to show that, well, it's hard to summarize. There is so much to point out. The commission doesn't do its job by calling the proper witnesses. Oswald was part of Navy intelligence. The State Department did send him over. It was radar work. Gary Powers mentions it in his book. And in the archives are documents Oswald's access to the U-2. It's a complicated thing, but people knew Oswald. The Soviet Union were in the White House the night of the murder.
Dialogue Assassination with political research specialist Mae Brussell here on KLRB. I'm Phil Kogan.